In September 1983, I went to high school at LaSalle Academy on 2nd Street, corner of 2nd Avenue in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which has since relocated to East 6th Street, 1 street north of 2nd Avenue, adjacent to the St. George Ukrainian Catholic Church and its school. LaSalle is a private Catholic all-boys school. At that time, keeping high school boys and girls separate in different academic environments was the popular thing to do in New York City, particularly when it came to private school instruction. Although we were educated separately, the boys and girls would get together one Friday night a month at our respective schools to socialize and dance. In addition to the dances, which were chaperoned by the school staff, I would also attend chaperoned co-ed social events organized by members of my Greek church at St. Demetrius, near my home in Queens. Living in Queens, I had to commute every weekday to and from LaSalle Academy by subway with the F train, which I took from its first subway stop on the 179th Street station and got off at the 2nd Avenue station. I remember seeing these enormous subway rats scavenging around the tracks and platforms looking for food. Most of my classmates had to commute to school as well, either by subway, bus, and even ferry, as they were coming from the 5 different boroughs across the city. Although I was not the best student in my grade, I was the top student in my own class. The best students in my grade were placed in the 2 advanced classes and kept apart from the average and below average students. In addition to getting high grades, I was also part of the cross-country jogging team, the track and field team, and the bowling team, winning my school numerous medals and trophies. Cross-country competitions were held at Van Cortlandt Park over in the Bronx, whereas the track and field competitions were held at various places in Manhattan, Queens, and Brooklyn. My bowling games were held in Manhattan. Whenever my father could, he came to see me and my teammates competing on Saturdays, sometimes alone, sometimes with Uncle Christos. My father would always buy my teammates pizza. My mother rarely came because she had to work almost every Saturday. If I was competing in the vicinity of Mount Sinai Hospital, I would drop by to say hello to her. My teammates would train for these competitions every afternoon by running either north from the corner of 2nd Avenue and 2nd Street until the Roosevelt Island Tramway, east to the FDR Drive along the East River, west to Washington Square Park, or south to Wall Street through Little Italy and Chinatown. My first 2 years in high school were also what inspired me to get into artistic drawing, as my friend Mark and his younger brother Chris were artists themselves, with the latter going on to become a professional pencil artist at both Marvel and DC Comics. I still have very fond memories of my time and friends at LaSalle Academy who were primarily from the track and field team. Mark, who was half Scottish, half Spanish, Joe, who was half Irish, half German, and hosted my farewell party at his home in Staten Island. Glenn, who was half Filipino, half German, and was originally from Montreal. Another Joe, who was half Irish, half Italian. A third Joe, who was Sicilian. Bruce, who was half Polish, half Irish, living in Greenwich Village. Hayden, who was the son of a Trinidadian ambassador, and another Mark, who was Eddie Murphy's cousin on his mother's side. I never got to meet the famous comedian who at that time was still on Saturday Night Live and had just released his stand-up comedy routine, Delirious, on video, but I did get to see family photos and get an autographed Christmas card in 1984. There was another colleague at school who claimed to have had pop singer Madonna as his neighbor 3 years prior when she was still a member of the local band, The Breakfast Club. The year 1984 was also the year that my friends and I went on a school trip to the Six Flags Great Adventure amusement park in New Jersey. Thrilling. As was often the case, we often went on educational school trips like visits to the Metropolitan Museum of Fine Art on Fifth Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. In July 1985, under pressure from my mother with the support of my brother, we moved back to Montreal. Our father was opposed to the idea of moving back, but eventually gave up. I had lukewarm feelings and deep reservations about moving back, but felt that I had little say in the matter as I was only 14 years old at the time. Even though I was 2 years away from graduating high school, my father and I already made plans to continue my education at either St. John's University, a private Christian school located near our home in the borough of Queens, or Fordham University, a private Christian-based research school in Manhattan. On weekend afternoons, our father would play soccer with my brother and I on St. John's University field, then teach us how to drive on the university's parking lot, which was typically empty at that time. If the parking lot was full, he would find another empty lot for us to drive. He did not believe in spending a lot of money on cars and always owned these run-down, crappy American cars. Lemons. During my childhood, he had only owned one good car, a Volvo which he got an amazing deal from this woman who was forced to relocate to another city immediately and sold her car to our father for cheap. Aside from that one time, he always bought junk, although one of them was a worn-out, unmarked police car with the siren still in it, which was kind of cool. Nevertheless, our father's cars brought us to where we needed or wanted to go, including South Beach in Staten Island, where we would sometimes swim in summer. My brother, who had graduated from the 8th grade at Immaculate Conception, was supposed to have gone to Archbishop Molloy High School, where the Cuomo brothers had attended, but our mother really wanted to return to Montreal because she missed the city and everything Quebec had to offer. She felt that Quebec was a better place because of its socio-political beliefs, public policies, and legal conventional practices on women's issues. Her cousin, who stayed in Montreal and worked as a nurse at the Montreal General Hospital with her Parisian husband, kept our mother up to date over the phone on what was happening in Quebec while we were living in New York. When I told my friends at La Salle Academy that I was moving back to Canada, they automatically assumed that I was going to Toronto, as it was remarkably similar to New York City. After I told them that I was moving to Montreal, a couple of them looked at me in bewilderment and asked why. They knew from either their own experiences or those of close family and friends that Montreal had serious issues with non-whites and non-francophones. One of my friends had even left Montreal with his family in the 1970s, even though he and his brothers were born there, to escape the hostile, unwelcoming environment toward ethnic minorities. Part 6. Our mother was convinced that we needed to go back to Montreal, even if it meant that she would have to accept a 30% reduction in salary working, even as head nurse, in the ER at the Montreal General Hospital, located 23 kilometers or 14 miles from home, which she commuted by city bus and subway or metro, 90 minutes each way, and also dealt with the different working ideology at the hospital. Our mother would always mock the hospital, which was a McGill University teaching facility, and its simplified approach to solving everyday tasks and responsibilities, delegate them to someone else. Generally, moving to Quebec meant paying higher taxes and a higher cost of living, and also dealing with colder and harsher winter conditions, which is the reason why the French in Canada use the expression "Mon pays si n'est pas un pays, c'est l'hiver," or "My country is not a country, it is winter," from the popular French song Mon pays, or My Country, by Quebec singer Gilles Vigneault. Moreover, my brother and I will now have to finish our high school education in French, a difficult, challenging task since my brother and I had never attended a formal French learning environment before. If that was not enough, for the first time in our lives, my brother and I had to deal with ethnic discrimination in Montreal, an experience that neither one of us encountered in New York City. Of course, even in New York, racial and ethnic tensions and disparities were still present, but they were steadily decreasing with each passing year, not because the white Anglo-Saxon majority suddenly developed a sense of consciousness and virtue, but because of mounting pressure for equity, equality, and fairness from united racial and ethnic groups. Solidarity. This need for unity from minority groups was derived from the need to survive in hostile, unwelcoming physical, social, and economic environments, not only in the United States, but also in other countries like Haiti, where mottos like "United we stand, divided we fall," and "L'union fait la force," unity makes strength, are used respectively in these countries to inspire solidarity. This sense of solidarity and strength in numbers from minority groups did not exist in Quebec until immediately after the 1995 referendum. Generally speaking, Canada is behind the United States by at least a decade in matters involving civil rights for racial and ethnic minorities, as the focus has been more concentrated on women's rights issues. In Quebec, the situation is worse as the focus is not only on women's rights issues, but the rights of its francophone population, typically at the expense of other linguistic and ethnic groups, which further pushes Quebec behind on civil rights matters of non-francophones by an additional 5 years compared to the rest of Canada. My brother was the first one to experience discrimination shortly after our arrival in Quebec, starting with a racial slur made to him for being an ethnic allophone, which were then followed by continuous harassment by the city police. It got so bad that he eventually had to give up socializing and confine himself to the safety of our home. Fortunately for me, it would be a few more years before I started feeling the full effects of ethnic discrimination in Montreal, typically with racial profiling from the city police, which resulted in unwarranted requests to pull over on the side of the road in my own neighborhood, questioning me and asking, "Where are you going?" My brother and I began to question our relocation back to Montreal and wondered whether our mother had forgotten about the ethnic tensions in Quebec between the Francos and the non-Francos. Did she forget that we were not pure laine, pure wool, Quebecers, nor would we ever be seen or treated as equals? How could she forget when the first man she fell in love with before she met and married our father was a pure laine Quebecois, who refused to marry her because of their ethnic differences? Heartbroken. The only place where my brother and I found solace from the discrimination was at the Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church on Sherbrooke Street, just east from St. Laurent Boulevard, where we were both baptized over 15 years earlier. We were both altar boys during the liturgy service every Sunday, but that soon ended when the church caught fire and partially burned down in January 1986. The rest of the church was torn down for safety reasons. Infighting over the church's reconstruction design stopped the church from ever being rebuilt. My brother and I then started to go to the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary Greek Orthodox Church on St. Roche Street. But the ambience and camaraderie was simply not the same, and we eventually found a place of worship that suited us at the Archangels Michael and Gabriel Greek Orthodox Church, located in the northern region of the city on Elie Blanchard Street, which was presided by Reverend Father Stephen Smith, who was half Greek, half British. Our ethnic background was never an issue, nor was it ever questioned when we were living in the United States. These only occurred after we had moved back to Montreal. Even though I was born with blonde hair and blue eyes like my paternal grandfather until the age of 2, by the time I moved back to Montreal, I no longer looked like a conventional Greek and began looking more and more like my maternal grandfather. I was typically seen by strangers as being Algerian, Lebanese, Egyptian, or other Arabic, Pakistani, Cypriot, Cuban, or black, or some other indiscernible ethnic visible minority. Regardless of the ethnicity that I was perceived to be, the results were always the same: discrimination. Of course, the discrimination was not confined to only the Montreal authorities. I had also experienced racial profiling again years later, quite a few times at the Calgary and Vancouver airports by non-Caucasian airport security staff. Astonishing. It was bad enough being racially profiled by Caucasians in Quebec, but now I had to deal with it from other ethnic minorities in the western provinces. I still remember 3 separate incidents when I was traveling alone on business as a federal employee when a turban-wearing airport security staff at the Calgary airport had randomly stopped me at one of the checkpoints and directed me to a private room so that he could conduct a strip and body cavity search on me. He did not even wait for me to get into the room when he snapped on a fresh pair of plastic gloves. I got annoyed by his actions and told him that if he had to search me, then he could do it out in the open in the middle of the hallway. I began to undo my shirt and pants out in the open. He was taken aback and said that it was unnecessary, then proceeded instead to do a simple pat-down over my clothes. I do not know why he selected me of all people, since it was clear from my name on my passport, government identification card, and the visible crucifix around my neck that I was a Canadian, born of Greek Orthodox Christian descent on government business. Maybe, in his head, I still looked too Arabic or Muslim to him, which in his mind justified a strip search or cavity search. Even if that was the case, a person's ethnicity alone is insufficient to warrant such drastic measures, but sadly we had just begun the post-September 11 era, and such practices and behaviors were becoming the norm. A similar occurrence happened a second time on another trip to Calgary when a female Asian airport security worker working the X-ray machines for carry-on baggage stopped me and accused me of having a gun inside my suitcase. I insisted that this was not the case, but she broke the lock of my suitcase to see for herself, since in her mind the X-ray machine does not lie, as she told me in her heavy Chinese accent. Needless to say, she did not find any firearm in my suitcase or any other prohibited items. She did not even feel bad about her mistake for the damaged luggage. Unapologetic. A third incident involved another Asian airport security worker, this time in Vancouver. He also stopped me to check my carry-on luggage. He was indifferent by the fact that I was on federal business and that I was returning to Ottawa. He made me open my luggage and began waving his black wand over every one of my packed items. Out of curiosity, I had asked him what he was looking for. He answered in his heavy Chinese accent, "White powder." I was shocked at his reply and assured him that I was not smuggling cocaine to Ottawa. He countered again in his heavy accent, "No, not cocaine, explosives." "Explosives?" I retorted startlingly. "You think I am a terrorist?" "I'm here on federal business, and I'm going back home to Ottawa," I replied steadfastly. He continued to wave his black wand as if my response to him did not matter. Nonchalant. My exchange with the Asian security worker caught the attention of another worker, a Caucasian English-Canadian who came to see what the commotion was all about. When he saw my passport and federal government identification card, he asked me in English if I spoke Greek. When I replied yes, he answered back in his best Greek, "I'm sorry, Mr. Angelus," as he helped me repack my suitcase. "Please proceed, my friend," he continued in Greek. Liberation. It is odd that I never had to go through such difficulties whenever I was traveling alone through Toronto or any of the American airports. When I was traveling with my wife and children, I was also never treated as a criminal suspect at airports and border crossings. In Greece and Toronto's Greek town, where I was often mistaken for a Cypriot, my children and I never experienced discrimination, But after having moved to Ottawa, before working as a federal public servant, I would hear cases of discrimination experienced by colleagues at work who were visible minorities. The way that they described it was that xenophobia in Ottawa exists, albeit covertly, and that people would either deny all allegations of racism, despite their passive-aggressive actions, or be in denial yet behave in ways that confirm their xenophobia. It is a different kind of racism than what I have seen, heard, and experienced in Quebec, where xenophobia was overt and, in some cases and environments, in your face. In Quebec, if you are from a minority group, you knew where you stood in society. In Ottawa, if you are ignorant or unaware of the xenophobia, you can blindly live your daily life with rose-colored glasses, until some incident happens to you or your family and friends as a result of racism and discrimination. I prefer the overt racism and xenophobia that one sees in Quebec, because at least you can prepare for it since you know what you are dealing with. With the covert and sneaky type of racism and xenophobia in Ottawa, you never know when you will get hit. Blindsided. In any case, I did not let racism, xenophobia, and discrimination stop me from living my day-to-day life and pressed forward with my dreams and aspirations. Forward. One of the ways that I pursued my dreams and aspirations was to finish my high school education at Collège François, a well-known and respected Montreal private school located in Park Extension, where the focus of the school was on quality education in the French language. The students, teachers, and staff came from diverse cultural backgrounds from Eastern and Western Europe, Northern Africa, Southeast Asia, Central and South America, Haiti, and across Quebec. Tolerance. Every weekday I would commute from my home in the northeastern part of the city where the Italians lived, to school by city bus and subway, followed by another city bus. Coincidentally, Collège François is located 0.6 kilometers or 0.38 miles from where I had lived as a young child before leaving with my family to New York City. Despite the challenges of studying and performing in French, I still managed to obtain the highest grade in my biology class. I did reasonably well in my other classes, but struggled greatly in my mathematics and physics classes. Nevertheless, I graduated high school in 1987 and celebrated by going to the high school prom with a friend from another school. The only girl at my school that did not have a date for the prom was this frenzied Chilean girl whom everybody called Anna Banana, who I was not interested in, even though it was widely known that she was infatuated with me. She would go to the point of waiting for me outside the school building before classes started, hoping for me to ask her to the prom. Nope. Anyway, my mother rewarded me for completing high school successfully by buying me half of a car, a blue 1983 Pontiac 2000, with the other half going to my brother. Even though I owned half a car, I still enjoyed cycling around the island of Montreal during the summers with my friends from high school, a bicycle trip of about 132 kilometers or 82 miles. Exhausting. I ultimately decided to continue my studies in English at Dawson College in the health science program, as learning mathematics and physics and French were hindering my natural ability to fully master these topics. I had to redo all of my high school mathematics, physics, and chemistry classes at Dawson to ensure that I fully understood and mastered the theories, rules, and applications in these disciplines. Retaking these courses had postponed my graduation from college by a year, but I managed to make up for 6 months of the lost time by taking summer classes in both 1989 and 1990. Dawson College is located in a former convent for nuns in downtown Montreal on Sherbrooke Street, corner of Atwater Avenue, which I commuted to from home with the number 32 bus on Lacordaire Boulevard to the Cadillac Subway Metro Station, and then continued on the Green Line to the Atwater Station. Dawson has a diverse cultural mix of students, professors, and staff. Even though I got along with white Anglophones, I felt more at ease socializing with other ethnic groups like the Greeks. Of course, like George and Dino, the Italians, Gabriel, Ronald, Tony, and Tony, the Portuguese, Roger, Pina, and the gang, the blacks from the Caribbean and Africa, the Filipinos, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Koreans, and the Jews. I had even dated a few Portuguese girls, as did my brother, but not the same ones. But none of the relationships got serious, not because I did not like or share their family values and warmth, but because I simply could not stomach eating Portuguese food. They say that a way to a man's heart is through his stomach. So, unfortunate. Anyway, when I was a student at Dawson College, racism and discrimination were not tolerated at all. In fact, I felt that there was even an oversensitivity and overreaction by some regarding ethnic comments that were benignly made. I recall an incident where I got into a disagreement with my Jewish friend Jordan. It was clear to me that he simply was not listening to what I was trying to tell him. Frustrated, I told him, "Jordan, you're not listening to me. What is it with you? Do I have to repeat myself in Hebrew to get you to listen to me?" Offended, Jordan stormed away from me and went directly to the college's Jewish Student Association. Word got around quickly at the college that I was anti-Semitic. I was summoned to the office of the Jewish Students Association and questioned by its president. After I apologized to Jordan, the president spoke to me in private and told me that personally he did not find my comment prejudicial, but as Jordan was a very sensitive guy, I had to be more careful how I spoke to him. He was known by the Jewish Students Association as the Jermaine Jackson of the college's Jewish community. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Jermaine Jackson, he is the older brother of pop singer Michael Jackson, who was often teased by their older brother Tito and would ask others to give him some tissue to wipe his tears. Jermaine is widely known for being overly sensitive to the point of crying for everything and nothing. Crybaby. I was able to restore my reputation at the college by clarifying what I said and apologizing to Jordan for hurting his feelings. When people heard my side of the story, they could not understand what the controversy was all about. Baffling. Meanwhile, our father had temporarily relocated back to New York City in 1988 to help fundraise for the Michael Dukakis presidential election campaign. At the time, Dukakis was the governor of Massachusetts and only the second Greek-American governor in American history, after Spiro Agnew, who was governor of Maryland from 1967 to 1969, before he went on to become vice president of the United States in 1969. Dukakis was campaigning against U.S. Vice President George H.W. Bush Sr. Our father takes pride in helping Dukakis with his fundraising campaign and had even become close friends with him. I still have a Michael Dukakis autograph on the Dukakis family photo given to me by my father during the 1988 election campaign. Unfortunately, Dukakis lost the election, only winning 10 states and the District of Columbia. Many, including Dukakis and our father, attribute the loss of the election to Dukakis's response to the capital punishment question posed by Bernard Shaw, the moderator during the second presidential debate with Bush Sr. on October 13, 1988. Dukakis's opposition to invoking the death penalty for a man who theoretically raped and murdered his wife made him come across as being indifferent and emotionalist, especially given that the theoretical victim was his wife. After the debate, our father, who was present in the audience, immediately approached Dukakis and told him that, "We have just lost the election." Sure enough, Dukakis's poll numbers fell from 49% before the debate to 42% the day after the debate. Dukakis's poll numbers continued to plummet until Election Day. Disappointing. The unfounded rumors of Dukakis's mental illness spread by Republican strategist Lee Atwater further damaged Dukakis's popularity among the general electorate. Before Atwater died from a brain tumor in 1991, he apologized to Dukakis for the defamatory and false allegations of mental illness made during the 1988 presidential campaign. Our father returned to Montreal after Dukakis lost the election in November 1988. In the summer of 1988, I worked at a food processing plant where I had to wear a hairnet, a helmet, gloves, boots, and a lab coat over my winter coat as the factory was continuously refrigerated. It was a good way to beat the hot summer heat, as the previous summer I had landed a job selling subscriptions to the Montreal Gazette newspaper from door to door. In the summer of 1989, I worked as a stock clerk in a local pharmacy that has long since gone bankrupt. In the summer of 1990, I worked baking pizzas at a local pizzeria owned by a former Montreal Alouettes football player, a black man originally from the United States whose regular client was the rock group Bon Jovi. They ordered pizza from us every time they came to perform at the Montreal Forum on St. Catherine Street West near Atwater Avenue. With the money that I made working summer jobs, I managed to buy my own car, a gray 1985 Toyota Tercel, and sold my half of the Pontiac to my brother, who in turn sold it for a red 1985 Toyota Tercel. Even though I was busy studying and working, I still found time to stay physically active by playing soccer and going canoeing, whitewater rafting, and camping. The year 1988 was also when Calgary, Alberta, hosted the Winter Olympics. Canada only won 5 medals, none of them gold. Dismal. At least Canada did better when they hosted the Winter Olympics again in 2010 in Vancouver, winning 16 medals, 14 golds, the most of all countries. Pride. In 1988, I also co-started a rock band in Montreal where I played keyboards, sang backup vocals, and co-wrote music. The band's name changed every time the lead guitarists and singers had to be replaced after they either quitted because of their inflated self-worth or left because of their personal addictions. The band's name changed from Mosaic to Knock Knock to Frozen Nipple to the Brian Ledger Band to Karina and the Bunsen Burners to ultimately The Wake, which had 3 different meanings: a vigil, the track left by a vessel passing through water, and to arouse. The style of music also changed from progressive rock to new wave to punk and glam hard rock, to blues rock, to pop rock, to classic rock, respectively. We mostly did other people's songs from the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, with the latter being my absolute favorite. But we also wrote and recorded some of our own original songs: Gatekeeper, Tell Me What You See, Under Control, Tell Her About It, and Why'd You Leave Me? I managed to get a local music producer to hear our demo recording of Gatekeeper, which impressed him enough to begin talks on an album. But my guitarist ego had gotten in the way and ruined our breakthrough into possible stardom. Guitarists. Despite the frequent changes, the spirit and heart of the band, along with its funky blues rhythm, remained stable and unchanged through me, the keyboardist turned bassist, and through Joe, the drummer, whom I met in my first college class and was of Haitian descent. Joe would go on to become a particularly good close friend. Even my parents liked him to the point of treating him like family. By the time the band stabilized with its 5 members and was baptized The Wake, I had switched to bass guitar, as it had become increasingly difficult to find and keep a natural bass player. Lead guitarists do not like playing bass guitar, as it took away from their egotistical need to show off their guitar solos. Making the transition from keyboards to bass guitar was not difficult for me, as I had a good ear, sense of rhythm, and solid musical background, learning piano during my childhood. My influences on bass guitar included Bernard Edwards, Bill Wyman, Paul McCartney, Mike Rutherford, John Taylor, Willie Dixon, Bootsy Collins, Russell Jackson, Trevor Bolder, Phil Feit, Muzz Skillings, and John Paul Jones. Still, I went and took formal bass guitar lessons from Bruce Patterson, who was a professional musician playing in a local, popular, well-respected rock and blues band, the Jimmy Dogs, whom I played a couple of songs with on stage and had gotten positive responses and applause from both the audience and the band members. Bruce had helped my band become more professional through his advice, guidance, and connections. Unlike the other band members, I did not have any female fans, except this one eccentric Vietnamese girl who followed me everywhere I went at Dawson College, but from a distance. Weirdo. My guitarist Stephen would tease me about her all the time. I didn't mind not having a huge female fan following like the other band members, as I was more interested in the musical and business aspects of the band, which by default made me the band leader. I was also the band's chauffeur, again by default, since I rarely drank alcohol and never did drugs. The band was an ethnically diverse group: Black, Chinese, Irish, French, Italian, English, Spanish, and Greek, with lots of talent, as evident by the fact that we all played at least 2 musical instruments, including the drummer. We rehearsed twice a week at our rented studio on Notre Dame Street, near the sugar and beer factories on the east side of the city. As is always the case in life, all good things had to come to an end. The Wake disbanded in 1992 after a few of the members came across opportunities to pursue other dreams outside the city. In addition to being in a band, I also was hired to DJ a couple of private parties, mostly 1980s dance and pop music, and teamed up with the nephew of Burton Cummings from the Canadian band The Guess Who to DJ songs, mostly rock and blues music from the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s over the college's airwaves. While completing my second diploma in the early to mid-1990s, I began working part-time as an orderly at various Montreal hospitals before settling at St. Anne's Veterans Hospital, located on the West Island of Montreal, about 42.5 kilometers or 26.5 miles from my home, where I was able to secure more stable working hours to supplement my income from the band to pay for my living expenses, utility bills, college tuition, textbooks, car insurance, car registration, car maintenance, car repairs, gasoline, art classes at the Montreal School of Fine Arts, my superhero comics, my music and movie collections. I could always rely on 2 of the scheduling clerks at St. Anne's to give me extra hours of work, since one of them, Irene, was of Greek heritage, and the other, whose name I cannot remember, but was clearly a francophone, had married into the Greek culture. It was not uncommon to see French-speaking women in Canada accept and even pursue Greek men for mates, since it was widely known that the sex between the two was too good to pass up. Sizzling. The other thing that the Greeks and Francophones in Quebec have in common is the love of black comedy. That is, a distinctive, off-the-wall, crude, earthy, sarcastic sense of humor with various degrees of inferences ranging from the suggestive to the explicit. It is often a sense of humor that is not well translatable or transferable into the English language and culture. Still, for the Greek, life is not all about good sex and good laughs. It is also about the importance of family and family-centered values, and unless the Francophone Quebecer shares these same family values, the relationship will not endure regardless of the Greek's efforts. Getting back to my original point, I was always on the go and did not have time for long-term relationships. My studies, my hobbies, my passions, and my work used up all of the time, as did most of my money, which I had saved to get a newer model car, a tan 1987 Toyota Camry. I literally did not have much money left after I paid for all my monthly expenses. I could not afford to go dancing in clubs on weekends, let alone eat out in restaurants. I was not the only one in college that was broke. Most of my friends, like Gabriel, an Italian Canadian, and Sonny, an English French Canadian who looked like Jim Carrey, were strapped for cash as well. Every so often, the three of us would get together to pool our leftover change to share a soda from McDonald's. Every time we arrived at the counter to order a soda with 3 straws, the person taking our order would look at us as if we were gay. We were not gay, we were broke. Gay men are rich. When we were really hungry or thirsty, we would go to our other friend Martin, a francophone, whom I got everybody to call Marty because he reminded us a little bit like Michael J. Fox from the movie trilogy Back to the Future. Marty had good looks, but more importantly, he had money to spare and spend on us. Even though Marty did not have a car, he was still able to score some dates with beautiful girls. Common sense. Hollywood star good looks plus money plus willingness to spend equal dates with beautiful girls. My Toyota Camry did help me get some dates with girls, but for the most part, they were short-term relationships. That had changed after I met my laboratory partner in my organic chemistry class in June of 1990, who eventually became my long-term girlfriend while studying nursing at Dawson College. There were only a few other guys in the nursing program, one of which was another Greek Canadian by the name of Chris. He would often joke in class. One time, one of our teachers, after having explained a difficult lesson, had asked us if we understood what she was teaching or if it was all Greek to us. Chris immediately responded that if what she was teaching to us was all Greek, he would understand her better. Smartass. Chris was not the only Orthodox Christian in our class. Irene, who came to Montreal from Russia a few years earlier with her husband and their 2 sons, is also an Orthodox Christian. Irene was about 50 years old at the time and always talked about her family, especially her oldest son, who was recently engaged to get married, and how she found the idea of losing her son to another woman painful. She genuinely seemed hurt by the engagement and expressed how she was angry that a woman out of nowhere just came into her son's life and was now taking him away from her, after she had poured all of her love, attention, and hard work into raising him. After I had seen and heard Irene's anguish over this matter, it reminded me of my own mother and how she felt about me getting married. Bizarre. Men are supposed to get married and move away from their mother's home. This is a natural part of life. But I suppose some women simply do not see it that way. I graduated from the program in June 1994 and had attended the graduation ceremony at the Palais des Congrès de Montréal, Montreal Convention Center, with my parents and my wife as my guests. I was the first one in my program to get onto the stage as the grads were being called in alphabetical order. The second that I got on stage in my black cap and gown, the other students and some of their guests stood up and cheered loudly while applauding. Unexpected. I was in fact startled by the response, as was the announcer, who happened to be my biology professor, because we did not know why I had generated such a large and enthusiastic response. I just smiled and waved at everybody before I went to shake the hand of one of the presenters, who was of East Indian descent, to get my diploma. I found out a couple of days later at school what the fuss was about. First, one of my college professors jokingly told me, "Here comes the local celebrity in our program, the only one to have generated mania Saturday night when he took the stage in his cap and gown." I did not think much of her response, as I thought that she was simply teasing me. Shortly afterwards, I ran into some students at the college who I had never met before. They recognized me and told me that it was a pleasure to finally meet me, as they had heard of my former band, The Wake. They were saddened that the group had disbanded a few years ago, as they had heard of us and wanted to hear us firsthand. They said that seeing me Saturday night was the closest they would ever get to seeing at least one of the band members from the wake on stage. Embarrassing, I did not believe that people still remembered the band, since it was about 3 years since we had last played. Maybe they were confusing us with this other band in Scotland with the same name, a band that we did not know existed when we had chosen and used the name as our own. Anyway, that was the last graduation ceremony that I had attended, as I was unable to attend my graduation ceremony for my bachelor's degree in science in 1997 because of my back injury. I also was not able to attend either of my graduation ceremonies for my 2 master's degrees in 2001, as I had to go to Greece to be with family, since I was not sure when I would be able to go back again. I am glad that I had gone to Greece in 2001, because events had prevented me from returning until 2007. I have always placed family duties and obligations before my own individual or egotistical needs. Besides, I am satisfied enough with having attended my graduation ceremony for the nursing program, mostly because it pleased my parents. Nursing was never my first choice to study and work in, although I did love my final internship at the oncology floor at the Jewish General Hospital. But my grades in physics were not high enough to get into dentistry. Nursing was my mother's idea, but I never had any intention to stay in the profession. For me, nursing was a portal to something else that was health-related. I had applied to both the bilingual English-French University of Ottawa and the predominantly French L'Université de Montréal. While waiting for their responses, I had even crossed the southern border into the United States to get my higher education accredited and validated by the New York State Education Department in Albany. After getting accepted into both universities, I ultimately decided on staying in Canada and went to the University of Ottawa, as it was more efficient with its programs, which was a difficult decision to make, as my mother had suffered her 3rd cerebrovascular accident, stroke, in 5 years, and was not sure who was going to help look after her. Thankfully, my brother took it upon himself to take that responsibility, freeing me to pursue my academic dreams and career aspirations. Opportunities for advancement were lacking for me in Quebec due to systemic discrimination, that is, elements within the hiring process that impede certain people of color from obtaining employment. I found that despite my fluency in French, my high education, and hard work ethic, I was stuck in a rut. Even with this social glass barrier lingering above me, I never stopped pursuing my goals and dreams. Determination. I moved to Ottawa on June 24, 1995, when Quebec celebrated their Fête Nationale. Before the separatist politicization and secularization of Quebec life, the June 24 national holiday was originally referred to as La Fête Saint-Jean-Baptiste to commemorate the feast day of Saint John the Baptist. Leaving Quebec for Ottawa on June 24th was a symbolic gesture of getting away from the political hurdles and obstacles set in place by Quebec politicians to safeguard the interests of pure-wool Francophone residents while ignoring the interests of other residents from other nationalities. Jacques Parizeau and his separatist political party, the PQ, had just gotten elected into power in September 1994 and had immediately scheduled a referendum on Quebec Sovereignty Association policy on October 30, 1995. Parizeau wanted an independent Quebec that still maintained economic ties with the rest of Canada. In other words, he wanted to have his cake and eat it too. Gluttonous. Moreover, he began cutting government spending on public programs, including health care, likely to fund his Sovereignty Association campaign, which prevented me on finding work as a registered nurse. I had learned in university that when provincial governments make cuts to health care funding, nursing positions are the first to go. Interestingly, months before the referendum was to take place, I was invited to participate in one of Parizeau's focus group on PQ television commercials promoting sovereignty. Naturally, I declined the invitation and told them that I was a staunch Federalist. That did not stop them, as they wanted me to attend the focus group even more. I suppose if they could sway someone like me to support the PQ Sovereignty Association campaign through their television advertisements, then they could deceive other Federalists into voting for it with the rest of Canada. I did not like Parizeau, and neither did his first cousin, whom I had met at an area hospital where I had worked as an orderly. His cousin had confirmed what I had already suspected. Premier Parizeau was an asshole, a drunk, and a racist who felt that ethnic groups had no place in a sovereign Quebec society. The truth about Parizeau would eventually be made public on the night of October 30, 1995, during his concession speech, which I vividly recall watching on national television that evening. We, Francophones Quebecers, failed to obtain our sovereign nation because of money and the ethnic vote. Repulsive. Part 7. If Canada is a limited democracy that allows eligible voters to choose their government once every 4 years or so, then democracy in Quebec is further restricted by the fact that every time an election is called, voters ultimately are limited at the ballot box, since the primary recurring question asked to Quebec voters is if they want to choose a representative of their riding to get together with other members of their political party and push for Quebec separation from Canada, or do they want a representative to stop the separation of Quebec from Canada? This is basically what all elections in Quebec, whether federal or provincial, are about. There is nothing else that distinguishes Quebec politicians and political parties apart from the issue of federalism or separatism. The boundaries that separate them suddenly become blurry. When one looks at the two main viable alternative political parties, one will notice that both occupy essentially the same ideological position on governance and public policy. Both the Liberal Party of Quebec and the Parti Québécois promote policies that generally enact government policies in an attempt to ensure social comfort and eliminate any form of social hierarchy and social inequality. This view is based on the belief that governments must play a key role in the protection and promotion of the economic and social well-being of its citizens. As a result of such thinking, governments directly intervene in areas of the economy, purchasing and owning or nationalizing property and industries such as electricity and banking to better control commodity prices and shelter users from market forces. Such governments attempt to distribute wealth equally as they feel that governments have a public responsibility to ensure that everyone has the minimum provisions to live a comfortable life. Such provisions for individual benefits and social services, such as health care and education, are funded through high taxations on those who possess or generate money above the average income of the residents in its jurisdiction. Furthermore, to ensure its authority over its citizens, these types of governments will impose other degree of secularization and anti-clericalism to eliminate competition and reduce the power and influence of religious institutions in its territory. Due to their paternalistic, or if you prefer, maternal nature and wealth distribution abilities, governments with left-leaning ideologies, directly or indirectly, affect the construct of the family and the roles and responsibilities of each family member. It is undeniable that Quebec is relatively the most socialist jurisdiction in Canada, mostly because of the effects of the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s, which resulted in a conceptual shift in the minds of the Francophones in Quebec, who saw themselves as being left behind socially and economically compared to the rest of Canada and even the United States. As a result, Francophones in Quebec have lost faith in religious institutions, namely the Church, as well as market economic forces which fall under the jurisdiction of the federal government. The cultural, linguistic differences between French Quebec and the rest of the English North American continent further created a need to seek protection and provision akin to an insurance policy from a powerful Quebec government and its agencies. In theory, a left-of-center approach to governing is appropriate and justified, but only under two conditions. First, increased government intervention policies should only be employed when the market economy poses a threat to certain vulnerable groups of people who otherwise can manage on their own, and second, when everybody, regardless of their ethnicity, religiosity, gender, and/or social class, is truly and fully treated as equal members of society and is given the tools and opportunities to excel in all aspects of their lives and those of their loved ones without continuously being dependent on the government for help. Give a man a fish, and you feed him for a day. Teach him how to fish, and you feed him for life. Self-sufficiency. In my opinion, governments should not replace or abolish the role of religious institutions, the roles of family members, or even market-driven forces, particularly during good economic times. Yet, this is what we have seen in Quebec to varying degrees since the late 1960s and early 1970s. I should note that Quebec is not the only jurisdiction in Canada that has been in a left-of-center rut for decades. Ontario appears to have gotten paralyzed on its right side, leaving its residents partially handicapped for over a decade, stuck with left-of-center government policies. At least in Ontario, there still remains a real right-of-center alternative for voters in its provincial elections when the electorate either feels the need for change or when they feel that left-leaning policies currently in place are no longer needed at this time. Before I forget, let me briefly explain the overall concepts of center-right ideology. There is a general distrust of government and the need to be free from its control and oppression. There is opposition to spending taxpayers' money on excessive and expensive social programs. There is a strong belief that people have the freedom to choose, which is tied to idea of market-driven competition and economy. There is an emphasis on supporting equality of opportunity while rejecting equality of outcome and income, as both are the responsibility of the individual. There is a strong sense of maintaining traditional family roles and values, as well as the preservation of religious rights and moral values. In Quebec, until recently, there was no viable right-of-center alternative to the Quebec Liberal Party and the Parti Québécois provincially, or the Liberal Party of Canada and the Bloc Québécois federally. Although the 2011 election appeared to suggest that the Quebec electorate has replaced the separatist and socialist-minded Bloc Québécois with the Federalist, but the still socialist-minded New Democratic Party. The 2014 Quebec election showed some promise as the centre-right Coalition d'Avenir du Québec political party was able to capture the hearts and the votes of about a quarter of the electorate. Nevertheless, Quebec residents who wished to see even less government intervention policies had no real viable choice but to either waste their vote on a right-wing political party which stands no chance of forming the government, subsequently allowing another party whose only real purpose is to push for Quebec sovereignty to win the election, or vote for the Liberal Party of Quebec to stop the sovereignty of Quebec. Duopoly. Many of you will argue that the options in the United States are not much different. I disagree. The United States may only have two real alternative political parties at election time, But those two choices are rather different, with the Democratic Party always steering left in its policies and the Republican Party always steering right. The choices could be perfected if there was a centralist alternative, but at least there are two clear distinctions. In Quebec, voters have no choice but to stay in the left lane of the highway, sometimes crossing over the line to its right with one or two of its tires. Sadly, the only two options voters in Quebec had before 2018 were to stay on the Trans-Canadian Highway in the left lane or to get off at the next exit. Indeed, it appears that Quebecers wish to remain on the highway for now. If you had not guessed by now, I favor a real, discernible center-right approach to governing. I by no means approve of far-right or radical right-wing policies. I was never one for extremism in either ideological direction, left or right, even in my everyday life. I have always lived in moderation, hardly ever plunging into extreme self-indulgent pleasures. In my opinion, extremist views and behaviors are indications of immaturity, insecurity, and closed-mindedness. And yes, the Parti Québécois is such a party, as is the Conservative Party of Canada. It is clear to me that both political parties have grown to become extremists with each successive new leader. If I have to label myself something, I will call myself a progressive or moderate conservative with strong environmentalist views, and for the hardcore political geeks who insist that I choose a color to identify my socio-economic and political views. I paint myself an aquamarine conservative, which blends blue with green political ideologies. Many may simply refer to such beliefs as an eco-capitalist ideology, while others will still call it a social blue conservative ideology, simply because they view all conservatives as being blue, despite an expressed conscience towards the environment. Regardless of your interpretations of me, one thing is certain: I am not a red-green ideologue or so-called eco-socialist, which merges aspects of socialism, communism with environmentalism. Eco-socialists largely believe that capitalism is the root of social segregation, poverty, war, and ecological degradation through globalization and imperialism. They endorse the dismantling of capitalist structures and the transfer of their production to the public through governments. In my opinion, eco-socialists have only got it partially right. Firstly, eco-socialists, for the most part, do not offer solutions to preserve the environment other than to leave it in the hands of governments who are managing it for the common people. Secondly, Red-Greens are still advocating the elimination of market-based capitalism to create equality among everyone regardless of the added efforts and sacrifices made by the individual. Where is the incentive and reward for working harder or longer than everyone else? Merit. Where is the remuneration for choosing to miss out on other foregone alternative options, that is, the opportunity cost, given that time is a scarce resource? Speaking of red, a red conservative, also known as a red Tory or high Tory, as the British prefer to call them, is someone who supports a balance of individual rights with social collectivism, often mediated by a religious standard of morality. They are often described as fiscal conservatives or Tories who possess more liberal views on social issues than most blue Tories, and they insist on maintaining some form of social order. Furthermore, a pink Tory is a conservative that is even more liberal on social government policies than a red Tory. I believe in the use of the free market system to shape government policies, such as an emission trading system, also called a cap-and-trade system, to stop increases in pollution in the short to medium term, since not all countries can economically afford to make drastic changes to their industrial production. I also believe that producers, consumers, and individuals all have a role and responsibility in doing their part to preserve the environment while still feeding the market-based economy. The government can encourage good environmental roles and behaviors in the short to medium term through tax cuts, tax credits, grants, low-interest loans, and other financial incentives. I refer to these collective approaches as responsible capitalism. Medium to long-term environmental policies would primarily entail the push and pull for renewable energy, which done correctly would also reduce the cost of production for industries, thereby increasing economic profits. I support the overall reduction of taxes and only imposing taxes to generate needed income to govern and to discourage people from engaging in certain behaviors and vices. Disincentives. Instead of generating income through taxes, governments need to be more responsible and efficient in their spending. Governments should privatize all or some of their property and either contract out or sell off some government-provided services. I am a firm believer in the decentralization of national power and transferring decision-making to local governments, communities, nonprofit and non-government organizations, including religious institutions. The concept of decentralization is that it provides a sense of ownership to those closest to the goods and services provided. When people feel that they own something, or at least can personally relate to it, they appreciate it more and consequently take better care of it. National governments should pursue and encourage free trade between countries to get rid of tariffs. The same products available in two different countries should not have drastically different prices. In regards to other policies, I feel that governments have a role and responsibility in ensuring social justice by assisting its residents realize their maximum potential so that they may contribute but also reap the benefits of their hard work, just as governments have a role and responsibility in ensuring social justice, so too does the individual, who must work on and invest in their own successes. Government policies would include cost-sharing such as startup grants, low-interest loans, subsidized education and skills training, and tax exemptions. I am a firm believer in freedom from oppression and the preservation of individual civil, constitutional, religious, and moral rights over the rights of the collective. No single group should be given preferential treatment, as every individual should be an equal with access to the same legal rights. I support a firm but balanced approach to law enforcement, with some legal infractions requiring an inflexible penalty, such as any harm and violence towards all men, women, and children, equally including abductions, as well as the trafficking of weapons, illicit narcotics, and people. While other infractions, such as those related to addictions, mental illness, or one-time mistakes, requiring a more forgiving and compassionate approach like rehabilitation, community service, reintegration into mainstream society, and criminal pardons. I tend to favor a hawkish, interventionist foreign policy, albeit with a reluctant, cautious deployment of peacekeepers and military combat troops. In matters involving social mores and values, I fundamentally believe that the family is responsible for ensuring that children are raised to be dutiful, respectful, mindful, civil-minded, ethical, honest, and generous, productive members of society. I still feel that the traditional family should be maintained, as it is the foundation for instilling the social and cultural values needed to keep everyone civilized and in cohesion with one another. Children should always be with family, as no level of government or any of its agencies or contractors can or should replace one's family. Parents, family members, and relatives must always do what is in the best interests of the children. Schools, community members, and religious institutions all have a role to play to support families in the development of children's moral values. When it comes to diverse social topics such as abortion, euthanasia, homosexuality, and addictions, I feel that government should not forcefully impose a punitive, heavy-handed, one-size-fits-all policy. Life oftentimes puts us in situations that are challenging, complex, and murky. Circumstances in life are not always consistent with simple black or white solutions. There are several shades of grays in life which at times require less than ideal responses. Governments should support citizens in making the best moral and responsible decisions in life and reprimand those who either exploit their rights or outright refuse to make better life choices. Furthermore, family and loved ones, as well as clergymen and other local community groups, have a duty and obligation to help and support one another during trying times, even when an imperfect solution must be undertaken. We need to show some interest in each other, as well as empathy and psychological comfort. This does not mean that government and other public agencies should pass their responsibilities and obligations to others, then turn their backs and walk away. On the contrary, those in authority and with the power and ability to help should not only take the lead in responding to an individual's crisis, but should also follow up for the simple sake of being concerned for the individual's well-being. Getting back to the topic of political ideology, I advocate a balanced approach to governing and policy making. The first time that I was able to vote and express my voice at the ballot box was at the Canadian federal election of 1988. The election was essentially a vote either for or against the Free Trade Agreement, FTA, with the United States, which was then under the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and his Progressive Conservative Party were in favor of the agreement, whereas John Turner and his Liberal Party were opposed to the FTA. Ed Broadbent and his Socialist New Democratic Party were also opposed to the FTA. In the end, the Progressive Conservatives won a majority government with 169 seats in Parliament, losing 32 seats since the previous election in 1984. The seats won by the Progressive Conservatives were predominantly from Quebec, with 63 of the 75 seats, and Alberta with 25 of the 26 seats, with the other provinces each providing the Progressive Conservatives with more or less half of their seats. The territories voted against the FTA. This is unsurprising, given that the Mulroney Conservatives was a party that was duly based and established to meet the mutual needs and interests of both Quebec and Alberta voters. Being a progressive conservative in favor of both the concepts of free trade and U.S. President Ronald Reagan, I was one of the Quebec electorate who voted for Mulroney's Conservatives. Although the FTA went through with the U.S. and later Mexico, Brian Mulroney resigned from office in February 1993 over growing voter opposition to his newly introduced Goods and Services Tax, GST, to address the negative effects of the worldwide recession of the early 1990s and his failed attempts at repatriating the Constitution in order to include Quebec as a legitimate partner in the Federation, and was replaced by Kim Campbell, Canada's first female Prime Minister. Like other Quebecers, I did not like Kim Campbell, but for different reasons, and neither apparently did voters in other provinces. Ironically, a public opinion poll taken across Canada just weeks before Mulroney's resignation indicated a restored faith and approval rating of Mulroney, as he had just enacted laws to protect the environment in accordance with national and international initiatives. The Progressive Conservatives failed to get re-elected with Kim Campbell in September 1993 as the political party was reduced to only 2 seats as the electorate in the English-speaking provinces voted in Jean Chrétien and his Liberal Party, with additional voter support from Anglophones, Allophones, and Federalist Francophones in Quebec. The separatists in Quebec voted for the Bloc Québécois, a newly created political party spewed from the ashes of the disintegrating Progressive Conservatives, which became the official opposition in Parliament since Federalist voters in Quebec, like me, saw the emergence of the separatist Bloc Québécois as a political threat to Canadian unity. We all voted for the Chrétien Liberals, regardless of whether we agreed with his ideology or his proposed government policies. It was the first time that Federalist voters in Quebec were now left with no viable options during federal elections other than voting Liberal. Provincially, this lack of voting options had existed since 1976 with the emergence of the Parti Québécois. In 1989, I had to vote for the re-election of Premier Robert Bourassa and his Liberal Party to prevent a victory by the separatist Parti Québécois led by Jacques Parizeau, who got elected into power anyway at the following 1994 election. Consequently, for every subsequent Quebec election, 1998, 2003, 2007, 2008, 2012, 2014, etc., and every subsequent federal election, 1997, 2000, 2004, 2006, 2008, 2011, 2015, etc., I would either have had to vote for a party I did not support to keep Canada united, or vote for a party that I did support and essentially waste my vote. Where is the true democratic choice in Quebec? It was time to leave. I also did not want to get stuck in a Quebec that had no job opportunities for ethnics, with elected politicians aggressively pursuing an agenda to separate from Canada to form a sovereign nation, albeit one that was still economically associated with the rest of the country through continued use of the same currency. I packed and stuffed my tiny green 1993 Honda Civic sedan with everything that I could squeeze in there and drove 200 kilometers, or 124 miles, east to settle in Ottawa, Ontario. The main reasons for the move to Ontario were because of the political instability in Quebec and its lack of employment opportunities for me, but also my wife, whom I had just married, who was not fluent in French and thus excluded from the workforce. The fact that there were other people interfering with my marriage, namely my mother, one of my sisters-in-law, one of my brothers-in-law, my mother-in-law, my wife's two sisters-in-law, and her classmate, Alikan Ali Nathu, who I noticed had become infatuated with her even though he knew that she was a newlywed, was another key factor for moving away. Meddlesome. Moving to Ottawa made logical sense as it was still close enough to Montreal to visit family, but far enough to escape the disagreeable influences that remained in that city. Neither my mother's weeping objections to leaving Quebec to live in another country, nor having been accepted to study at the Université de Montréal, was enough to keep me in Montreal. Besides, my mother still had my brother living with her. He applied to join the Canadian military, but was refused because of his medical conditions. His rejection from the Canadian military was a blessing in disguise, as there were numerous reports of sexual assaults and rape within the armed forces, about 50% in both Canada and the United States, of soldiers committing heinous and degrading acts towards one another, regardless of their sex or sexual orientation. He ultimately got a job as a mechanical engineer at the General Motors Assembly in Sainte-Thérèse, just north of the city, after growing tired of being an orderly at the Montreal General Hospital for nearly a decade. The decision for me was already made to leave Quebec for greener pastures. Part 8. I had just moved to Ottawa weeks before my wife did because of a job offer that I accepted as a registered nurse at an Ottawa hospital located on the city's west end. My wife joined me weeks later as she was still finishing up her final semester of school at Concordia University. I myself was going to start my undergraduate studies in science at the University of Ottawa in September 1995. By that time, available working hours at the hospital started to become scarce as the Premier of Ontario, Mike Harris, was aggressively implementing his common sense revolution, which cut government spending to reduce the province's ballooning deficits put in place by his predecessor, Bob Rae. I ended up working for 2 temporary help agencies which helped me get work at various area hospitals in the city as well as private duty in people's homes. The hours given to me were sporadic. Nevertheless, I was given enough work and money to pay off all our living expenses while I was studying at the university. My wife, although a recent university graduate, was still unable to secure employment in her field of computer programming, so I was left with the responsibility of paying our monthly expenses. I was no longer able to work much as a nurse as I had severely injured my back in the summer of 1997 while on the job. The years of wear and tear over the course of 6 years from lifting heavy, bedridden patients as both an orderly and a nurse on medical, surgical, orthopedic, geriatric, and palliative floors had taken its toll on my back. Fortunately, I was able to stand upright and walk again through physiotherapy and acupuncture. It became evident to my physician that continuing to work in the field of healthcare, particularly where heavy lifting was involved, would put me at high risk of permanent and irreparable damage to my back. As my wife still had not found employment, I continued to find some light work in psychiatry, although those hours alone were never enough to pay for the rent and all of the bills, which were supplemented with hours working as a healthcare support worker in people's homes. I was keen on getting a master's degree in administration to leave the actual healthcare delivery field for an office job and avoid putting my physical health at risk. I also wanted to escape the nursing politics that I encountered working at the area hospitals. Unbearable. To make matters worse, my father just had a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, and had to undergo quadruple bypass surgery. I remember having to rush out of town to go to see him after my last final exam. Thankfully, the surgery went well, and my father was on his way to full recovery. Hallelujah! The health scare was a wake-up call for my father to slow down and retire from working. He eventually sold his rental properties in Brooklyn, as commuting to Brooklyn from home and back was proving to be too much for him. He used the money to buy a vacation ranch in Tampa, Florida, that he wanted to leave to his grandchildren. But he also bought a modest rental complex nearby, which was looked after by his brother Paul, who already retired and had moved to Tampa. In order to generate income, as he did not have a private pension plan from his previous self-employment, the money he was receiving from the Quebec Public Pension Plan was not enough to live on. Also, despite his surgical recovery, my father was not able to help my brother look after our elderly mother. My brother did his best to look after her alone while concurrently going to work. When my wife finally landed a 2-year contract in November 1997 with the Federal Department of Public Works and Government Services, she gave me permission to stop working and continue my graduate studies full-time so that I may finish and graduate sooner, in December 2000 as opposed to December 2003. I had just graduated from the University of Ottawa with a Bachelor of Science degree, B.Sc., in the summer of 1997, which was immediately followed with part-time studies in the autumn in the Masters in Health Administration, MHA program at the University of Ottawa. I got accepted into the program because of my high grades in my bachelor studies and also the good recommendation letters from 3 of my professors, one who was impressed by my dissertation on child labor laws, a dissertation inspired by events in Africa, China, and India, a second who complimented me on my presentation on the privatization of government-owned institutions, and a third who really liked my business proposal for identifying and soliciting to a niche market in a major industry. Studying full-time was challenging, as the MHA program was intense and compressed from 3 years to 15 months. Demanding. I almost failed in completing the graduation requirements as I did not have sufficient time to adequately learn and master the subject matters. It was only while I had taken some economics and statistics courses at Carleton University that my professor suspected that I had a learning disability and referred me to a learning specialist and a psychologist whom confirmed the professor's suspicions and had me officially diagnosed with a mild form of dyscalculia, that is, difficulty processing numbers such as time, space, distance, and measurement. The learning specialist and psychologist were impressed that I had made it this far academically without receiving the required assistance, but credited my strong memorization skills, my visual and acoustic attention to details, and my perseverance for my successes in life. These coping skills and adaptation mechanisms alone could only take me so far. Now that I was officially diagnosed with dyscalculia, I was entitled to 50% more time on my exams and assignments, as well as access and use of assistive computer software programs and devices to help me with my disability. I do not have a problem with learning itself, just that it takes me about 50% more time than the average person to work with numbers. These assistive tools not only helped me graduate from the University of Ottawa with a Master of Health Administration degree, MHA, in December 2000, but also helped me obtain another master's degree in Public Administration, MPA, from Carleton University in May 2001. My mother was happy that I accomplished my academic goals and was hoping that I would return home to Montreal. But her hopes died when I was offered a job with the Federal Public Service after having graduated from Carleton University. She knew that I was not coming back. I enjoyed the course topics at Carleton and preferred the learning environment and the genuine concern and accessibility of its professors to those at the University of Ottawa. Still, I am glad that I got the opportunity to study at both universities, as I credit Ottawa for my entrepreneurialism and Carleton for my writing skills and analytical thinking. Even though I preferred the academic approach to learning at Carleton University over that of the University of Ottawa, I could not really get into the left-leaning ideological culture present in the classrooms at Carleton. I clearly understood the theories behind socialism and the justified arguments for big hands-on governments with a need to tax and spend money on programs and benefits, but I could not embrace and adopt the entire concept wholeheartedly. At times, my term papers and presentations suffered because of the lack of enthusiasm in writing or talking about the benefits of government interventionist policies. No matter how hard I tried to write an objective paper or do presentations, my true colors were revealed. A couple of my professors did not like my lack of passion for their cherished ideology. As a conservative, Tory, even a progressive moderate one, I was seen by some as the enemy in their territory. I remember getting a B- as my final grade by one of my professors, originally from Winnipeg, who confronted me about my weak performance in his class, and I decided there and then that I was going to be honest with him rather than come up with some lame excuse about issues in my personal life affecting my performance. In the end, it paid off. I told my professor that I was a conservative who appreciated and understood the policies of the left, but I simply did not agree with these types of policy measures because I could not relate to them. He was surprised at my honesty and even bumped my final grade up to a B. Right or left, Honesty is still the best policy. I have always maintained an upfront and honest attitude at school, work, and everyday life, but oftentimes people would be mistrustful of my actions and intentions. For example, during my class presentations at Carleton University, I always had the habit of furnishing food and beverages to my audience, but many of the students viewed that with suspicion, as they believed that I was bribing our professor in order to receive a better grade. They would always quote the classic saying, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," which is a saying that comes from the ancient Greek story of the Trojan horse. Our professors knew better than to suspect anything bad out of my gesture and would simply educate the students on the traditions of Mediterranean hospitality. Exactly. Most of our professors at Carleton University were cultured and open-minded. There was one professor in particular that really kept me coming back for more. I eventually registered and took every single class that he had taught. In one of his classes, he talked about elected federal politicians and how they were coming to Ottawa from their electoral ridings to enact change to get better policies which would benefit local constituencies. Our professor said that once these elected members of Parliament stepped off the plane in Ottawa, they immediately changed upon breathing in the Ottawa air. Sniff. It was as if there was something in the air which made everyone in the city become identical, lifeless robots, which in the end did absolutely nothing to foster change in Parliament. This airborne thing would carry itself into the federal public service from Parliament, which in turn infected their families at home, which in turn proliferated into and infected local neighborhoods and communities. Epidemic. All of the city's inhabitants would eventually get infected by this thing, and its effects on inhabitants seemed to stay within the confines of the city. Our professor did not go further in explaining what this thing is or its source. He simply confirmed its existence and said that when inhabitants left the city, whatever this thing was stayed in the city waiting for them to come back to Ottawa. Creepy. It would be a decade before I figured out the source and effects of this thing, a thing I now call the Ottawa virus. But while I was still a graduate student at Carleton University, I guess I unconsciously started befriending other students who were not from Ottawa. There seemed to be a natural pull to socialize with out-of-towners. New Brunswick, Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, Edmonton, Vancouver, and even foreign students from out of the country. In retrospect, it occurred to me that these students were, for one reason or another, immune from, or at least not yet infected by, the Ottawa virus. Two of these students, Nick from Winnipeg and Michael from Toronto, would go on to become my closest friends. Nick, who was of Greek Orthodox descent, ultimately became the godfather of my firstborn child, and Michael, who is of Guyanese Catholic descent, is treated by my parents, brother, and I like family. At my second-born's baptismal reception, Michael was seated beside my own mother at the dinner table, along with her cousins. Michael and I had also worked together at the Federal Ministry Department of Health, Health Canada, which was the first job that I got as a federal public servant after graduating from Carleton University. Nick, who was already employed at Health Canada, had pulled some strings and put in a good word with some managers at another branch to hire Michael and me in May 2001. Although technically speaking, I only started work in June as I had to go to Greece so that my relatives could meet my wife and our 13-month-old daughter, since they were neither able to come to our wedding years earlier nor our daughter's baptism 7 months earlier. When Michael and I both started working at Health Canada in 2001, another one of my former schoolmates from my graduate program at the University of Ottawa had also started work at the same time and same branch as us. Sylvie was in the business administration, MBA, side of the joint MBA-MHA program. Even though she looks like Jennifer Aniston, the Greek-American Hollywood actress, Sylvie was a pure-wool francophone from Gatineau, Quebec, just across the Ottawa River. Although technically she was born in the city of Ottawa, which makes her a Franco-Ontarian, she ended up marrying a man who was originally from the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, a Newfie, and at the time lived on the Ottawa side of the river. It was becoming increasingly trendy for Francophone women to marry non-Francophone men, but even then, only the brave and adventurous ones did so. Michael, Sylvie, and I grew to become good friends for many years until Michael got promoted to the Treasury Board of Canada. I ended up leaving the branch for a promotion at another branch within the same department in September 2003. Despite being in different offices, we all managed to stay in touch about every month or two, particularly over the lunch hour, mostly talking about our jobs, but also our memories as graduate students at Carleton and Ottawa U. The University of Ottawa has a different ideological culture than Carleton. It is undeniably on the right side of the political spectrum. The degree of conservatism varied in the student population and among the professors, but the environment was clearly somewhere on the right. The university's culture is clearly defined by its love of competition, use and encouragement of business and private sector strategies, even in government and the nonprofit sector, innovation and research, and overall aggressive, hawkish approach to learning, which was present not only in the Faculty of Administration, but also the Faculty of Science. Still, it was a great academic experience. There were many classes which I enjoyed and learned a lot from, like my human resource course. My human resource professor, who was of Southeast Indian descent, and was educated at both Harvard and Cambridge universities, discussed in one of my classes how Canada, particularly in the private sector, is trailing in assisting ethnic minorities enter and move up the workforce, and that countries like the United States have a parallel system in place alongside the one for Caucasian Anglo-Saxons to help minorities like the black population succeed in the labor market. In the U.S., there are strong community support groups sponsored by the private sector and non-government sector, and government programs and subsidies that help blacks achieve their maximum potential. Anyway, the competitive culture at the University of Ottawa brought along problems of cheating on exams and assignments, particularly with the students in the business administration classes, which all the health administration students were required to take and pass in order to graduate. Despite the widespread cheating which was brought on by the pressure to pass the courses, I had never cheated. I preferred to work longer and harder on my assignments, presentations, term papers, and exams, even if it meant that I received a lower grade despite my laborious efforts. Rather than succumb to cheating, I found other ways to impress my professors and earn my grades. I used humor in my human resource course to get my point across. I did these glitzy, extravagant theatrical presentations using music, special effects, and other props for my marketing course. I did some research into my professor's passions and found that he had a love of Quebec's healthcare system, which I used to secure a niche in his class. As I was one of a few students in class from Quebec and was fluent in French, to read up on Quebec's health policies for my term papers, which got higher than average grades. For my thesis, I simply chose the nicest, most down-to-earth professor that the faculty had. I did not mind what the topic was. I was flexible and ready to work hard. Dr. Dennis Caro, a German-Canadian from Montreal, was looking for someone to work on emergency preparedness and response, and I was more than willing to oblige. The preparatory work for my thesis paper involved personal interviews in Ottawa and Montreal, particularly on the then-recent handling of the 1998 ice storm, as well as face-to-face interviews with representatives of agencies in Toronto and Kitchener-Waterloo, the former of which was a woman of Greek-Canadian heritage, on their emergency response experiences and preparedness strategies. There was tons and tons of researching, reading, and writing involved, but in the end, it yielded my thesis in 2000, which was published the following year in Volume 14, Issue 4 of the Healthcare Management Forum under the title Federal Governments in Emergency Management in Canada, Quo Vadis? To give the publication more credibility, I had my thesis professor, who was already widely known and respected in his field, share the recognition for my work and listed him as co-author. This is not to say that he did not do any work. In fact, he was the one who truncated my thesis, which is available in its full form at all universities in Canada, into an abridged, more reader-friendly version for the general population. The publication was on information sharing among governments during emergencies, particularly natural and man-made disasters. It was released at a timely moment in our history, 2 months after the September 11 attacks in the U.S. The publication increasingly became a consultation piece by various levels of government in North America and even Africa.